In a cold October dawn, as observatories in Hawaii and the Canary Islands synchronized their latest datasets, a strange silence fell upon the command centers of Europe. The object known as 3I divided by Atlas, an interstellar traveler, neither comet nor asteroid in the conventional sense, had just entered the arc of NATO's most guarded briefings. What was supposed to be a purely scientific observation, catalogued by pan-stars and refined through the lenses of the European Space Agency, suddenly mutated into a classified signal. NORAD's monitoring systems, those usually attuned to ballistic shadows, had triggered alerts that could not be dismissed. At once, the security apparatus of the West began humming with unease. Leaked fragments of reports hinted at orbital projections that looked less like natural trajectories and more like vectors of intent. Within hours, NATO had convened an extraordinary meeting in sealed chambers, summoning both its military strategists and, for the first time, leading astronomers whose expertise was now deemed inseparable from global defense. The presence of generals and astrophysicists at the same table revealed the multidimensional weight of 3I divided by Atlas, suggesting that this interstellar fragment was no longer just a visitor, it was a test of perception, perhaps even of power. Tonight, we embark on a new journey, where the theme of 3I divided by Atlas forces NATO's most secret military meeting, yet appears not only as a scientific phenomenon, but also as a question that challenges our imagination. If you enjoy this kind of quiet, long-form storytelling, if it helps you learn, focus, or simply relax at the end of a noisy day, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this space truly brings you peace. Where are you on the map? Let me know where you are in the world and what time it is in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all around the world. And so we return to the table where military uniforms brush against the notebooks of astronomers. Behind the locked doors of NATO's most secret assembly, conversations swirled about the meaning of this cosmic intruder. Was 3I divided by Atlas a mere celestial wanderer, or could its sudden shift in orbital readings conceal something engineered, something that justified the language of security alerts rather than scientific notes? Among the whispers, another hypothesis emerged, one never meant for the public ear. Perhaps NATO was not only reacting, but also adapting. In the shadow of 3I divided by Atlas, the possibility of weaponizing space gained traction, its momentum cloaked in the legitimacy of planetary defense. What better excuse, some argued, than an interstellar anomaly to accelerate the long-buried dream of militarizing the heavens? And thus, in this meeting veiled from the public, the idea of a war fought in the silence of space was no longer just a plot of fiction, but a possibility contemplated in real time. The official narrative, disseminated through carefully worded press releases and scientific conferences, is one of prudent planetary defense and enlightened scientific vigilance. According to current models of solar system dynamics, the statistical probability of a civilization-ending impact, while infinitesimally small on a human timescale, is unequivocally non-zero over geological time. The near-Earth object, NEAR observation programs, spearheaded by agencies like NASA and the ESA, are thus framed as a global insurance policy, a necessary endeavor to map the potential hazards lurking in the darkness. The deployment of advanced tracking systems, including the next-generation space-based telescopes and radar installations, funded in the wake of the 3I divided by Atlas event, is presented as a logical, even noble escalation of this effort. Scientists suggest this could be due to a newfound appreciation for the vulnerability of our technological civilization, a collective awakening to the lessons implied by the craters on the moon and the event that sealed the fate of the dinosaurs. The technology being developed hyperspectral imagers, sensitive enough to discern the composition of a baseball-sized object 1,000 kilometers away, and laser-ranging systems capable of pinning its orbit with millimeter precision, is lauded for its dual-use potential, serving both the cause of pure science and the imperative of planetary security. But does this narrative of benevolent vigilance fully account for the specific nature and classified capabilities of the systems being rapidly deployed under its auspices? The speculative hypothesis, therefore, posits a far more calculated and terrestrial motive. The 3I divided by Atlas object, in this interpretation, was not merely a catalyst but a casus belli in absentia, a convenient and unassailable justification for the accelerated militarization of low Earth orbit and cislunar space under the impeccable banner of scientific necessity. The very name, 3I divided by Atlas, evokes a dual meaning: the mythological Titan condemned to hold up the celestial spheres, and the modern acronym for Advanced Tracking and Laser Analysis System. This confluence is unlikely to be mere coincidence. Under the public-facing mandate of monitoring the 3I divided by Atlas class object and its potential kin, a secretive parallel program is set into motion. The public sees the scientific instruments, the strategic analysts see the prototypes for directed energy weapons and hyper-accurate targeting platforms. The exquisite sensors designed to characterize the surface of a rogue asteroid are, from a different doctrinal perspective, the very same systems required to identify the vulnerabilities on the hull of an adversary's satellite. The sophisticated tracking algorithms that predict a rock's path over decades are directly applicable to calculating the firing solution for an interceptor. The line between Guardian and Sentinel has become perilously thin, blurred by the cold logic of military innovation. Could it be that the true purpose of this grand astronomical endeavor is not to watch the skies for rocks, but to dominate them against rivals? This grand strategic pivot unfolds not with the clamor of public debate, but through a silent, three-tiered transformation, a paradigm shift as profound as the advent of nuclear deterrence, yet conducted in the spectral quiet of classified budgets and black world research facilities. The first and most foundational level is the technological surge. The 3I divided by Atlas event provided the political and financial impetus to overcome the significant technical hurdles that had long plagued advanced space-based systems. Research into laser tracking and laser ranging, once a niche field with limited funding, is suddenly supercharged. The challenge of propagating a coherent beam of light over millions of kilometers, compensating for atmospheric distortion, solar radiation pressure, and the minute but critical effects of general relativity, is now treated as a strategic priority. The stated goal is to achieve an unprecedented level of fidelity in measuring the trajectory of distant objects. Yet, the underlying physics is identical to that required for a different application. A laser, not merely for measuring, but for affecting its target. The leap from a low-power rangefinder to a high-energy device, capable of dazzling a sensor, degrading a solar panel, or even physically disabling a component, is one of engineering scale, not fundamental principle. The technological seeds being sown for planetary defense bear a striking and unsettling resemblance to the roots of a spaceborne anti-satellite capability. When a nation masters the art of pushing a threatening asteroid off course with a sustained laser pulse, has it not also demonstrated the capacity to perform the same action upon a man-made object? On the second level, that of military doctrine, this technological evolution precipitates a philosophical revolution. For decades, space power has been largely passive, a domain of support and reconnaissance. The core tenets revolved around deterrence through the threat of denial, the protection of one's own assets, and the situational awareness provided by overhead eyes. The 3I divided by Atlas hypothesis, however, signals a potential shift from this posture of passive deterrence to one of active, preemptive presence. The doctrine is no longer just about seeing and understanding the orbital battlefield. It is about controlling it. The concept of domain awareness expands to include domain control. The platforms launched to monitor the space environment are, by their very design and orbital placement, instruments of denial, capable of occupying strategic slots and projecting a persistent, unblinking gaze over an adversary's territory and orbital assets. This is the militarization of the Lagrange points, the transformation of neutral gravitational havens into forward operating bases for a new kind of sentry. The public rationale is a global early warning network, a shield against celestial bombardment. But from a strategic competitor's perspective, this network looks indistinguishable from the skeleton of a battle constellation, a web of sensors and potential effectors that could, in a crisis, to be turned from looking outward to looking down. Is a shield that can be so easily reconfigured into a sword truly just a defensive measure? The third and most volatile level is the geopolitical, where actions beget reactions in an inexorable and accelerating feedback loop. The rapid advancements and doctrinal shifts undertaken by NATO nations, justified by the 3I divided by Atlas event, do not occur in a vacuum. They are meticulously observed by the strategic intelligence apparatuses of rival powers, most notably Russia and China. These nations, with their own ambitious space programs and doctrines of counterspace operations, are unlikely to accept the Western narrative of purely scientific and defensive intent at face value. History provides a sobering lesson. The development of the atomic bomb by one power inevitably spurred its pursuit by others. The deployment of a new class of warship triggers a naval arms race. The same immutable logic applies to the orbital domain. The deployment of what NATO calls the Atlas Sentinel network is interpreted in Moscow and Beijing as the opening gambit in a new, high-stakes competition for space supremacy. Their response is predictable and already, in all likelihood, underway. The acceleration of their own counterpart programs, the development of asymmetric anti-satellite technologies, and the proliferation of their own scientific and dual-use orbital platforms. A technological vortex is thus initiated, a self-perpetuating cycle of action and counteraction where each defensive measure is perceived as an offensive threat, justifying further escalation. The 3I divided by Atlas object, a silent and mindless piece of cosmic debris, may have inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that partitions the heavens into spheres of influence, turning the final frontier into the latest arena for terrestrial conflict. Can a cycle born of mutual suspicion and technological one-upmanship ever be broken, or does its internal logic demand an eventual, and perhaps catastrophic, culmination? The ultimate outcome of this silent war in the shadows presents humanity with a stark and bifurcated future, a fork in the road of its cosmic destiny. In the positive scenario, the technological surge catalyzed by the 3I divided by Atlas hypothesis yields a genuine and robust global early warning system. The very same networks of sensors and effectors designed for a potential conflict serve to plug a critical gap in our planetary defenses, providing decades of advance notice for any genuine existential threat from the cosmos. The international cooperation required to track and characterize such threats could, in an ideal world, become a template for broader collaboration, a shared human endeavor that transcends terrestrial squabbles. The mastery of space-based energy and precision guidance could unlock new frontiers in propulsion, resource utilization, and even communication. The shield, in this optimistic view, remains a shield, and its construction unites humanity against a common enemy from the void. Yet, the negative scenario casts a long, cold shadow. The relentless logic of the security dilemma takes hold, and the orbital domain becomes thick with countermeasures, jammers, hunter-killer satellites, and dormant weapons platforms, all cloaked in the ambiguous language of safety and situational awareness. A single miscommunication, a software glitch, or an accidental collision in the high frontier could spiral into a conflict that instantly cripples the global infrastructure upon which modern civilization depends, from financial networks and GPS to weather forecasting and communications. The new space race would not be for flags and footprints, but for dominance and survival, rendering the heavens a contested and dangerous battle space for generations to come. Does our future among the stars mirror our history on Earth, destined to be written in the same old language of conflict, or does the vast, silent context of space itself compel a new, more enlightened form of statecraft? As these nascent constellations of power and observation silently take their places in the firmament, their unblinking eyes are not trained solely on the distant, receding point of 3I divided by Atlas. Their gaze is equally, and perhaps more intently, fixed upon the terrestrial sphere below, and upon the rival constellations being assembled by other earthly powers. The data streams flow not only to scientific institutes, but to the strategic command centers in Brussels, Moscow, and Beijing, each analyzing the other's movements with a mixture of professional curiosity and profound strategic apprehension. The silent dance has begun, a complex ballet of technology and suspicion played out in the unforgiving medium of orbit. But as these powers meticulously track each other's every move under the shared, unassailable pretext of cosmic watchfulness, a pivotal question begins to emerge from the silence, a question that will define the next chapter of our orbital age. Before the silent, profound question posed by the void, a signal of unknown provenance, a whisper from the cosmic deep. The terrestrial maps of power, so often delineated by borders of ideology and ambition, find their gaze drawn upward in a rare, unified moment of apprehension. Russia, China, and the NATO alliance, entities whose strategic postures on Earth are defined by a complex calculus of deterrence and dialogue, now confront an anomaly that transcends their terrestrial disputes, a celestial interlocutor that does not recognize the sovereignty of nations nor the contours of their geopolitical rivalries. This convergence of attention upon a single point in the star chart is not born of a newfound harmony, but from the primal imperative of a species confronted with the unknown, to observe, to analyze, and ultimately, to determine if the other is a neighbor to be greeted or a predator to be feared. The great radio telescopes of the world, from the venerable Arecibo's legacy to the sophisticated arrays of the square-kilometer Pathfinder, have for decades been our ears cocked toward the cosmic symphony, listening for the faint, telltale deviation in the hydrogen line that might signify intelligence. And now that a potential signature has been registered, the very instruments built for pure inquiry become the most critical assets of national and collective security. Could it be that our first confirmed contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence will not be with the creators of a message, but with the silent, technological artifact they have left behind, a cosmic buoy or a derelict vessel adrift in the interstellar currents, its very presence a test of our planetary maturity? The initial, almost reflexive response from the great power blocks has been one of intense, clandestine scrutiny, a multi-spectral surveillance campaign conducted under the guise of routine scientific observation. The tracking networks, once dedicated to monitoring orbital debris and the trajectories of satellites, are now finely tuned to the ephemeris of the object, designated 3I divided by Atlas, its trajectory and characteristics analyzed with a precision reserved for the most critical of military assets. According to current models of orbital mechanics and materials science, the composition and flight path of such an object could be deciphered to reveal its point of origin, its method of propulsion, and perhaps even its age, providing the first tangible clues to the technological capabilities and intentions of its creators. The James Webb Space Telescope, with its unparalleled infrared sensitivity, and China's FAST, with its colossal collecting area, along with Russia's revitalized deep space network, are all independently gathering photons, each nation hoarding its raw data, processing it through proprietary algorithms in secure facilities, treating each byte of information as a strategic commodity more valuable than any mineral resource. Scientists operating within these closed ecosystems suggest that the initial phase is one of pure characterization, a necessary process to establish fundamental facts before any broader conclusions can be drawn, a process not unlike the careful autopsy of a meteorite, but conducted across millions of kilometers of vacuum. Yet, the very nature of this partitioned investigation raises a profound question. When knowledge itself becomes a zero-sum game, a resource to be monopolized rather than a discovery to be shared, does the act of observation become the first salvo in a new kind of conflict, one where information is both the weapon and the territory? From this tense parallel observation emerges the first speculative hypothesis: the establishment of a neutral facility, a contact outpost, positioned at a Lagrange point, a gravitational oasis of stability where the representatives of humanity's disparate factions could congregate to study the phenomenon under a banner of shared curiosity. Such a concept draws inspiration from the precedent of the International Space Station, a triumph of post-Cold War cooperation where modules built by nations once locked in ideological struggle now orbit in harmonious union, a testament to the possibility of scientific endeavor transcending political divides. The framework for such an outpost already exists in nascent forms, in the collaborative protocols of the International Astronomical Union and the data-sharing agreements that underpin global climate science, suggesting that a dedicated facility for 3I divided by Atlas analysis is not a flight of fancy, but a logical, perhaps necessary evolution of our institutional response to a shared existential question. The outpost would function as a cosmic Switzerland, a sanctified ground where data streams from all national telescopes could be fused, creating a composite image of the object far richer and more detailed than any single nation could achieve alone, and where the world's foremost exoarchaeologists and xenolinguists could work in concert to decipher its secrets. But does the very act of proposing such a utopian construct not highlight the deep-seated fissures it seeks to bridge? And can a structure born of mutual suspicion ever truly foster the trust required to speak with one voice to the stars? The counter-hypothesis, darker and more reflective of the prevailing winds of terrestrial geopolitics, posits that cooperation will be stillborn, yielding instead to a frantic, clandestine race to construct sovereign telescopes, immense instruments whose primary purpose is not enlightenment but exclusivity. Imagine a future where the far side of the moon, that radio-quiet sanctuary shielded from Earth's cacophony, becomes the site not of an international observatory, but of competing lunar bases, each housing a colossal dish aimed perpetually at three. Divided by Atlas, their operations classified at the highest levels of state secrecy. The data harvested by these instruments would be considered a national secret, analyzed by teams of scientists sworn to silence, their findings disseminated only to a small circle of military and political leaders who would then decide, unilaterally, how to proceed. This path mirrors the early days of the nuclear age, when the knowledge of atomic fission was both a scientific triumph and a state secret of the utmost sensitivity, leading not to a global consortium for peaceful energy, but to a terrifying arms race. The allure of monopolizing first contact, of being the sole recipient of a technological revelation that could confer an unimaginable advantage, be it in energy, propulsion, or computation, might prove an irresistible temptation for any power seeking to reshape the global order in its image. If knowledge is power, then is the ultimate power not the power to define reality itself, to control the narrative of humanity's place in the cosmos before that narrative has even been written. The evidence for both potential futures coexists in the present moment, a schizophrenic reality where cooperation and competition are pursued in parallel, their trajectories not yet diverged into a single, decisive path. The same nations that collaborate on the International Space Station and contribute to the global asteroid defense network simultaneously develop and test anti-satellite weapons, creating a cloud of debris that threatens the very orbital infrastructure upon which all spacefaring nations depend. The scientific community itself is a microcosm of this tension, with researchers freely sharing preprint papers on astrophysical phenomena, while their home institutions are bound by strict export controls on the dual-use technologies that enable the most advanced forms of remote sensing. This duality is our legacy, a reflection of a species capable of both breathtaking altruism and profound territoriality. The detection of 3I divided by Atlas has not created this dichotomy, but has merely held a mirror to it, magnifying the stakes to a cosmic scale. Can a species that has not yet fully learned to manage its own planetary commons truly be expected to steward a dialogue that encompasses the light years between stars? The analysis of this geopolitical and scientific stalemate must therefore be conducted at three escalating levels of engagement, each representing a fork in the road for humanity's collective future. The first, a trial by fire, would involve the barest minimum of cooperation, the exchange of precise orbital ephemeris data for 3I divided by Atlas. This is a pragmatic, almost cynical form of collaboration, born not of trust but of mutual self-interest, ensuring that no nation's surveillance assets accidentally collide or interfere with another's, a basic traffic management system for the cosmic investigation. It requires no shared interpretation of the data, no exchange of raw signals or spectral analyses, merely the coordinates of the object itself, a set of numbers that confirms the shared reality of its existence without revealing anything about its nature. This is the diplomatic equivalent of two rival explorers agreeing on the location of a treasure map without agreeing to share the treasure, a necessary first step that avoids immediate conflict, but does nothing to build a foundation for a shared endeavor. Is a relationship built upon such a minimal, self-serving transaction a foundation for future cooperation, or merely a temporary truce in a longer, more protracted Cold War? The second level, that of limited collaboration, would represent a significant, though precarious, advancement. This would involve the shared allocation of key observation windows, a coordinated schedule where the world's most powerful telescopes, from the 30-meter telescope to the upcoming extremely large telescope would act in concert, each trained on 3I divided by Atlas, at a predetermined time to gather complementary data across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. A radio observation from fast during a specific period of the object's rotation could be paired with a simultaneous infrared spectroscopic analysis from the James Webb and a visual light photometric reading from an observatory in Chile, creating a multifaceted dataset that would be incomparably richer than any single observation. The sharing of these specific, time-sensitive data packets would be a gesture of considerable trust, an admission that the whole of human scientific capability is greater than the sum of its nationally partitioned parts. It would require the creation of a secure, neutral clearinghouse for data, likely managed by a body like the European Space Agency, or a pair, consortium of neutral academic institutions, and would be fraught with the risk of one party reneging or attempting to spoof the data of another. Does the profound scientific value of such a synthesized dataset outweigh the immense political and security risks inherent in its creation? And who would be the ultimate arbiter of the truths it reveals? The third and most profound level of engagement would be the forging of a new alliance, the establishment of a transstellar accord that would govern all future interactions with 3I divided by Atlas and any subsequent extraterrestrial discoveries. This would be a treaty of unprecedented scope, a legal and ethical framework designed not for nations, but for a planet, outlining protocols for communication, governing the use of any derived technology, and establishing principles for a unified human response. It would be the culmination of the Enlightenment ideal, the moment where reason and collective interest finally triumph over parochialism and fear. The alternative to this new alliance is the grim prospect of a stellar curtain, a fragmentation of knowledge where data becomes a national possession, leading to competing interpretations of the object's intent, conflicting attempts at communication, and ultimately, a scenario where humanity presents not a unified face to the cosmos, but a cacophony of competing, distrustful voices. In such a future, the greatest discovery in human history could become the catalyst for our final, self-inflicted conflict, a war fought not over land or resources, but over the meaning of a message from the void. Will the gravitational pull of a shared cosmic destiny prove strong enough to overcome the centrifugal forces of our ancient earthly divisions? The ultimate outcome of this silent vigil, this collective holding of breath by the great powers, thus presents a stark choice between two divergent futures for humanity. One path offers the tantalizing possibility of scientific diplomacy, transcending old axes of conflict, where the shared mystery of 3I divided by Atlas becomes the crucible in which a new planetary identity is forged. The successful management of this first contact scenario could establish a template for solving other existential threats, from climate change to asteroid impacts, proving that our species is capable of acting as a single, intelligent entity when faced with a challenge from beyond. The other path leads into a chilling darkness, the risk of a stellar curtain descending, not of iron, but of data and silence, fragmenting human knowledge and eroding the last vestiges of international trust. In this scenario, the object itself becomes a passive, malevolent force, not by its own action, but by its effect on us, revealing not the secrets of an alien technology, but the fatal flaw in our own human nature. As the great powers continue their watch, their instruments tracing the silent arc of 3I divided by Atlas against the backdrop of the fixed stars, the question is no longer about what the object is, but about what its silent, looming presence will compel us to become. And so we are left to contemplate the final, most unsettling scenario, a contingency that exists in the locked safes of strategic command centers, a plan for which no precedent in international law exists. For what if the silent artifact suddenly awakens? In the profound and echoing silence that exists between the stars, where the laws of physics are both scripture and map, humanity has always operated under a singular, unspoken assumption that we are the sole authors of our destiny within this cosmic theatre. Our forays into the void, from the first tentative Sputnik beep to the profound gaze of the James Webb Space Telescope, have been guided by a framework of international treaties and principles. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which explicitly states that celestial bodies are not subject to national appropriation, and that space is to be used for the benefit of all mankind. This legal architecture, a testament to our highest ideals, was constructed for a universe we presumed was ours alone to explore, a set of rules for a game where we were the only players. But what happens when the board itself changes, when a piece appears that was not, and could not have been, accounted for in the original design? The appearance of 3I divided by Atlas, an object whose very nature whispers of origins beyond our comprehension, has forced upon the strategic minds of global powers a chilling and unprecedented calculus. In the absence of established law, the plan times becomes times the law. This is not a mere adjustment of policy, it is the clandestine drafting of a new cosmic constitution, written not in the halls of Geneva, but in the secure briefing rooms of Brussels and Norfolk, a document whose first and only article is the preservation of human civilization against the utterly unknown. The legal vacuum surrounding contact with a non-human intelligence is as real and as vast as the interstellar medium itself. Our existing space law, an intricate tapestry woven from the threads of the Cold War, meticulously governs the actions of states in space, prohibiting weapons of mass destruction in orbit, and affirming our collective ownership of the Moon. Yet, it remains utterly, profoundly silent on the matter of what to do should an artifact of another intelligence, a vessel or a probe, enter our celestial sphere. There is no protocol, no established channel of communication, no precedent for first contact that carries the weight of law. This is not an oversight, but a reflection of a previous era's limitations of imagination. Within this void, the standard procedures of crisis management have always possessed a tendency to outpace and supersede established norms. The creation of NATO itself was a response to a geopolitical landscape for which the existing League of Nations framework was deemed insufficient. Is it any surprise, then, that faced with an object like 3I divided by Atlas, which exhibits potential technological signatures, the Alliance would begin to draft response protocols that exist outside the very international legal framework it was designed to protect? The plans, therefore, are not born of a desire for conquest, but from a primal imperative for survival, a logical extension of the precautionary principle into a realm where the potential risks are literally incalculable. Thus, the hypothetical framework begins to take shape, not as a public decree, but as a classified set of standing orders known as the Intelligent Artifact Engagement Protocols. This is not a document of diplomacy, but one of contingency, a triage manual for a potential encounter with a patient whose biology is alien and whose intentions are inscrutable. Its first and most critical component involves the establishment of a secure transmit-receive channel, a dedicated and isolated frequency reserved solely for attempted communication with the object, shielded from the cacophony of earthly radio traffic and military jamming. This would be coupled with a temporary, strategic quarantine of specific radio bands, a cordon sanitaire in the electromagnetic spectrum, particularly focusing on the hallowed hydrogen line at 1,420 MHz, a frequency any technologically sophisticated culture would recognize as fundamental to the universe. The rationale, according to current models of potential contact scenarios developed by organizations like the SETI Institute, is to create a clear, noise-free avenue for dialogue, to prevent a catastrophic misunderstanding born of signal interference or the impulsive, chaotic chatter of a panicked world. But what underlying fear, what unspoken suspicion, drives the need for such stringent control over the very medium of contact? Is the primary goal to facilitate a conversation, or to ensure that should the object speak, its voice is heard first, and exclusively, by those with the authority to decide if its message should ever reach the public ear? This leads to the most profound and legally contentious element of the protocol, the granted authority for physical intervention should the object be deemed a threat to critical infrastructure. The definition of critical infrastructure here undergoes a radical expansion, encompassing not merely power grids and communication networks, but the very orbital pathways upon which our global society now depends, the GPS constellations that guide our ships and financial transactions, the early warning satellites that guard against nuclear attack, the orbital eyes that monitor our changing climate. Scientists and engineers might suggest that a passive object, following a predictable orbit, poses no immediate kinetic threat. Its mere presence, however, in a realm so densely populated with assets essential to modern life, represents a systemic risk of an unprecedented magnitude. A single, unplanned maneuver, an unexplained emission of energy, could cascade into a collapse of the delicate technological ecosystem upon which billions depend. The protocols, therefore, must account for this vulnerability. But does the principle of self-preservation, the undeniable right of a species to defend its home, grant a coalition of nations the authority to extend its jurisdiction over an object that is, by every existing legal standard, res communis times the common heritage of all humanity? Where does defense end and appropriation begin when the entity in question is not another state, but a silent envoy from the void? The analysis of potential engagement unfolds across a graduated scale of escalation, a carefully calibrated dance of observation and action designed to minimize uncertainty while maximizing control. The first level, designated as soft approach, is one of intense, multifaceted surveillance without direct intervention. Every available asset is brought to bear. The infrared gaze of the JWST searches for thermal anomalies that might betray internal power sources. The sprawling arrays of radio telescopes like the Allen Telescope Array and the 500-meter aperture spherical telescope, FAST, listen for any faint whisper of emission, and orbital tracking stations plot its position with micrometer precision. The object is studied as a natural phenomenon, a cosmic specimen, with the hope that its secrets will reveal themselves through passive observation. This approach aligns perfectly with the scientific method and the principle of non-interference, a watchful waiting game played out across the background of the solar system. Yet, this passive observation is itself an act of profound significance, for it gathers the intelligence required to inform the more decisive actions that may follow. Can true understanding ever be gleaned from a distance, or does the very act of observation, of defining and categorizing, alter the nature of the thing being observed, and in doing so, to alter our own path forward? Should the object's behavior, or perhaps its mere trajectory, be assessed as posing a potential future hazard, the protocols would authorize a shift to the second tier, limited intervention. This stage moves beyond observation into the realm of subtle influence. The most likely tactic would be an attempt at indirect orbital adjustment. This would not involve a direct, physical push, a concept as crude as it is likely impossible. Instead, planners might consider a sophisticated application of known physics, deploying a small, unmanned spacecraft to station keep near the object, using its own minuscule gravitational pull, a gentle and continuous tug, to ever so slightly alter the object's path over weeks or months. The stated goal would be purely defensive, to nudge it away from a collision course with a cluster of vital satellites, or to guide it into a safer, more stable, and more easily monitored orbit, such as a Lagrange point. The scientific justification would be rooted in celestial mechanics and planetary protection protocols, framed as a necessary act of celestial housekeeping. But this act of shepherding an unknown intelligence, however gently, represents a fundamental shift in the human role in the cosmos, from observer to actor, from student to custodian. What unanticipated reactions might such a gesture provoke from an intelligence that may perceive the universe through a sensory and conceptual framework entirely alien to our own? The third and most severe level of engagement, strategic quarantine, is the point where the protocol crosses a definitive threshold from defense to active containment. This would be enacted if the object were to demonstrate active, directed, and potentially hostile use of the electromagnetic spectrum. For instance, if it began broadcasting a powerful, complex signal towards Earth, or worse, if it appeared to be scanning or attempting to interface with our military or financial networks. The response would be swift and absolute, a concerted, global effort to jam its transmissions and isolate it within a specific band of frequencies, effectively creating an informational moat around it. The secure transmit-receive channel would become the only open line, a single controlled gate in an otherwise impenetrable wall. The most extreme and controversial provision within this tier, a clause undoubtedly debated in hushed tones, is the authority for a sample retrieval, a mission to capture, or to attempt to extract, a physical piece of the object for study. The scientific impetus for such an act would be overwhelming. The analysis of a material sample could reveal everything from its place of origin to its technological principles. The legal and ethical ramifications, however, are staggering. It is an act that moves from influencing an object to seizing its very substance. Does the existential need to understand a potential threat ultimately invalidate the concept of sovereignty when applied to a non-human entity? And if we were to succeed in such an endeavor, would the fragment we hold in a laboratory be a trophy of our ingenuity, or the first spoil of an interstellar war we did not even know we had started? The potential outcomes of enacting such a shadow protocol paint two starkly different visions for humanity's future. In the positive scenario, these clandestine plans function as they are designed to, acting as a crucial buffer against the shock of the unknown. They provide a structured, calm, and unified response to an event that could otherwise shatter global order into a billion panicked fragments. By having a plan, NATO and its partners could manage the initial encounter, mitigate risks to the global technological infrastructure, and potentially facilitate a controlled, deliberate first contact, all while preventing a rash, unilateral action by a single state that could plunge the world into chaos. The protocol becomes a stabilizer, a secret scaffolding holding up the fragile edifice of human civilization until it can adjust to a new and vastly larger reality. But is stability purchased at the price of transparency, a foundation that can truly last, or does it create a hidden fault line that will inevitably fracture under the pressure of revelation? Conversely, the negative outcome presents a dystopian realignment of global power. The very existence and implementation of an extra-legal framework by a military alliance would create a seismic shift in the international legal order. It would establish a precedent that in matters of ultimate security, might makes right, and that a self-selected group of nations has the authority to act as stewards for the entire planet, making decisions of cosmic consequence without consultation or consent. This would inevitably breed deep resentment and suspicion among nations outside this inner circle, potentially fracturing global unity at the very moment it is most needed. The precedent set for unilateral intervention in a domain that is, by law, the province of all humankind could unravel decades of careful diplomatic work in space governance, inviting a new, uncharted era of cosmic realpolitik. If a coalition can claim the right to seize and study an alien artifact, what principle then prevents a nation from claiming a resource-rich asteroid or a strategic position on the moon? Have we, in our desperate attempt to write a law for the unknown, inadvertently authored the blueprint for our own descent into a fragmented and competitive interplanetary future? The protocols for 3I divided by Atlas, therefore, represent more than a military contingency. They are a philosophical gambit, a wager on the nature of the universe and our place within it. They are born from the collision between our highest laws and our most ancient instincts, a testament to the fact that when faced with the truly inexplicable, the human mind will first seek to build a cage of understanding, however provisional, before daring to look inside. We have prepared our response, a sequence of actions and reactions designed to tame the infinite possibilities of a first contact into a manageable operational flowchart. But as we stand on this precipice, our carefully drafted plans in hand, we are forced to confront the most unsettling question of all. Can any protocol conceived by a human mind, bound by human fears and human logic, ever hope to be adequate for an encounter with something that exists entirely outside its frame of reference? For the object itself remains, stubbornly and profoundly, an enigma, its very substance whispering that our models, our laws, and our fears may be but the faintest of echoes in a cosmos filled with voices we have not yet begun to hear. And what if the object's defiance of our understanding is not a mere gap in our knowledge, but a fundamental challenge to our perception of reality itself? For recent scientific reports indicate that the properties of 3I divided by Atlas do not conform to any known physical model, suggesting we may be in the presence of something that operates on principles we have not yet, and may never, divine. When data refuses to lie quietly within the pages of our textbooks, the very horizon of our knowledge begins to shift. This is the profound and unsettling reality ushered in by the arrival of 3I divided by Atlas, an interstellar object whose properties defy the comfortable certainties of our physical models. Its passage through our solar system was not merely a celestial event, but a silent interrogation of our understanding, a siren call from the depths of the galactic void that challenges the foundational principles we once considered immutable. We observe its trajectory, its composition, its very nature, and we are confronted with a cascade of anomalies that cannot be reconciled with the inert, rocky, or icy bodies that populate our cosmic neighborhood. According to current models, an object of such origin should be a simple relic of planetary formation, a pristine time capsule from a distant star system, its behavior predictable through the well-trodden paths of orbital mechanics and thermodynamics. Yet, from the moment of its discovery, 3I divided by Atlas has behaved as something else entirely. Its spectral signatures and dynamic interactions with the solar environment suggesting a complexity that borders on the architectural. The initial data, a stream of photons captured by the most advanced telescopes at our disposal, presented not the familiar absorption lines of common ices or silicates, but a perplexing, almost engineered pattern of emission and reflection. Could it be that we are witnessing not a natural formation, but the first tangible evidence of a physics that operates on principles we have yet to imagine? A silent ambassador from a realm where the rules are written in a different hand. The speculative hypothesis, then, must venture beyond the conventional. Perhaps 3I divided by Atlas is not a simple asteroid or comet, but an entity possessing hybrid material properties, a cosmic superconductor, or a self-stabilizing structure of vacuum foam. The notion of a cosmic superconductor suggests a material that permits the frictionless flow of electrical currents across astronomical distances, a substance that could, in theory, harness magnetic fields in ways that explain the object's non-gravitational accelerations without the typical outgassing observed in comets. Its albedo, that measure of reflectivity, is anomalously high and curiously uniform, fluctuating in a manner inconsistent with simple rotation, but rather resembling the modulated shimmer of a vast, crystalline lattice. Scientists suggest this could be due to a unique surface chemistry, perhaps a mantle of exotic ices we have not yet catalogued. But that fails to account for the coherence of its light curve, which implies a structural integrity and symmetry that nature, in its chaotic generosity, rarely produces unaided. The vacuum foam hypothesis is even more radical, proposing that the object is not solid matter as we know it, but a localized, metastable knot in the very fabric of space-time. A relic from the universe's first inflationary moments, a bubble of a higher energy vacuum state that has somehow persisted, its internal structure dictating its interactions with our reality. This would render it less an object and more a region of space with different physical constants, a pocket universe drifting through our own. If this is the case, then what we are studying is not merely an object's surface, but the boundary membrane between two different phases of reality. The evidence that fuels such extraordinary speculation is rooted in the meticulous, yet bewildering observations gathered during its brief sojourn. Interstellar observations have always been the harbingers of exception, and 3I divided by Atlas is no different, presenting a triad of confounding data: its spectral absorption, its albedo, and its non-gravitational acceleration. The spectral data, analyzed by instruments like those on the James Webb Space Telescope, revealed not the stark, discrete lines of atomic transitions, but broad, shallow depressions in the electromagnetic spectrum, as if the light passing through or reflecting from it was being processed, rather than simply absorbed. Its albedo was not that of a dark, primordial rock, but of a highly polished, almost metallic surface, yet it displayed none of the thermal characteristics one would associate with a metal radiating absorbed sunlight. Most tellingly, its path through the solar system was marked by small but significant deviations from a purely gravitational trajectory, accelerations that occurred without the telltale coma and tail of a comet shedding material. The standard explanation invokes rocketry effects from sublimating ices, a known phenomenon for solar system comets. However, certain anomalies still defy all conventional explanations, particularly the timing and magnitude of these accelerations, which seem too finely tuned, too efficient, as if the object were capable of modulating its interaction with the solar radiation field itself. Is it possible that we are not observing passive outgassing, but an active, albeit subtle, form of propulsion, a technology of trajectory correction that operates on principles we have yet to decipher? To truly grapple with the implications of 3I divided by Atlas, one must engage in a layered analysis, beginning with the most conservative adjustment to our worldview and proceeding to the most revolutionary. The first level is a recalibration of our existing models, an expansion of the framework of non-gravitational forces. This is the path of least resistance for science, to take the anomalous accelerations and refine our equations, to invent new parameters for outgassing or radiation pressure that can, with sufficient complexity, account for the observed path. We could propose novel Yarkovsky-like effects or interactions with the solar wind mediated by an unusually strong magnetic field, perhaps one frozen into the object's superconducting core. This endeavor alone would enrich our understanding of celestial mechanics and plasma physics, pushing the boundaries of our computational models to their limits. But does this process of continual patching and adjusting ultimately lead us to a deeper truth, or does it merely create an increasingly cumbersome and ad hoc theory designed to ignore a more fundamental and perhaps more terrifying simplicity? The second, and far more disruptive, level of analysis confronts the possibility of chi-Tsilao exotic matter. If the hybrid material hypotheses hold even a grain of truth, then 3I divided by Atlas is not just a puzzle to be solved, but a treasure trove of potential technological revolution. A confirmed cosmic superconductor, operating at the temperatures of interstellar space, would upend our entire field of materials science, offering a blueprint for energy transmission and storage beyond our wildest dreams. The concept of a stable vacuum foam structure would provide a tangible pathway toward understanding dark energy and perhaps even manipulating the cosmological constant. The technological spin-offs from simply attempting to replicate its properties in a laboratory could seed the next generation of aerospace engineering, quantum computing, and energy technologies, transforming our civilization. But if such materials can exist naturally, what processes, what forces of nature, operating on galactic scales or in the hearts of alien stars, are required for their forging? This leads inexorably to the third and most profound level, a cognitive turning point. 3I divided by Atlas may ultimately demand a new normal for interstellar celestial mechanics, a paradigm shift as significant as the move from Newtonian mechanics to general relativity. It forces upon us the humbling realization that our physics, developed in the cozy confines of our single solar system, may be a provincial set of laws, not the universal canon. The object's very existence challenges the Copernican principle. The idea that we do not occupy a privileged position in the universe, not in terms of location, but in terms of our fundamental perception of reality. We have built our science on the assumption that the laws we discover here are the laws everywhere. But what if we are the ones living in the anomaly, and 3I divided by Atlas is the messenger from the true, wider universe? A universe far more complex and bizarre than our limited senses and instruments have so far allowed us to perceive. The ultimate question then becomes not about the object itself, but about us. Are we prepared to accept that our current understanding is not just incomplete, but potentially myopic? A small and parochial view of a cosmos teeming with phenomena that defy our very definitions of life, matter, and existence. The final outcome, however, is not one of despair, but of immense positive potential. The very act of wrestling with the enigma of 3I divided by Atlas enriches our science immeasurably. It pushes the fields of materials science and aerospace engineering into uncharted territories, forcing innovation not for its own sake, but out of sheer necessity to comprehend. The seeds for next-generation technology are sown not in incremental improvement, but in the fertile ground of profound mystery. The object's legacy may not be an immediate answer, but a permanent and productive state of questioning, a reinvigoration of the human spirit of inquiry on a cosmic scale. And as we stand at this new precipice, looking out at the stars with a renewed sense of wonder and trepidation, we must consider the guardians we have appointed to watch the skies. This naturally leads us to a deeper, more terrestrial contemplation. As the global alliance of nations turns its collective gaze and its most powerful instruments towards the void, one must ponder the true nature of their vigil. Is the coordinated effort, often shrouded in the language of security and defense, truly about protecting the Earth from a physical threat? Or is its more profound purpose to safeguard the fragile stability of the human psyche and our collective cognitive framework in the face of the truly unknown? The vast silent ocean of space has long been a mirror for humanity's deepest anxieties and grandest aspirations. We point our instruments, the delicate ears of radio telescopes, and the piercing eyes of orbital observatories like James Webb toward the void, not merely in search of data, but in search of meaning. And in that search, we are perpetually confronted with a fundamental duality: the quest for knowledge and the profound fear of what that knowledge might ultimately reveal. It is at this precise juncture, this liminal space between discovery and understanding, that we must contemplate the true nature of our first line of defense. For sometimes, the most critical form of defense is not the protection of territory, but the safeguarding of the human mind itself against the existential vertigo induced by the truly unknown. What if the fortifications we have built are not of steel and signal, but of psychology and perception? Consider the hypothetical scenario: a quiet protocol running in the background of global governance. Alongside every public announcement concerning the enigmatic 3I divided by Atlas phenomenon, a meticulously crafted, cognitive pacification protocol is deployed, a soft, societal sedative designed not to obscure the truth, but to modulate its psychological impact. This is not a conspiracy in the crude sense, but a sophisticated application of risk communication strategies, long studied in contexts ranging from pandemic response to nuclear incident management, now scaled to address the ultimate unknown: contact. The core principle is ancient, even if the tools are modern. How does a civilization tell its citizens that they are not alone, or that the universe is far stranger than their cosmology? Aloud? The established practices of crisis communication always account for the potential for public panic. When the subject is interstellar, the psychological repercussions become exponentially more difficult to predict. Could it be that our greatest fear is not the message itself, but our own unpredictable reaction to it? This protocol operates across a carefully stratified architecture, a multi-layered defense against cognitive dissonance. At the individual level, it manifests as a convention of blurring details that could induce primal fear, a deliberate softening of edges on data that is too sharp, too alien, for the human psyche to process without fracturing. It is the digital equivalent of a physician's calming tone, ensuring the patient is stable before delivering a life-altering diagnosis. This is not necessarily an act of censorship, but rather one of translation, filtering raw, potentially traumatic information into a format the conscious mind can assimilate without triggering a cascade of existential dread. But where does the ethical line lie between responsible mediation and the infantilization of the public sphere? Does the duty of care eclipse the fundamental right to confront the unvarnished reality of our cosmic context? Ascending to the community level, the protocol dictates a rhythm of disclosure that is gradual, layered, and framed within the familiar, stabilizing confines of scientific dialogue. Information is released not in a single, overwhelming torrent, but in a series of calibrated waves, each followed by a period of expert analysis, peer debate, and public digestion. This transforms a potential cultural cataclysm into a managed, iterative process of collective education, allowing the social organism to adapt and incorporate the new reality at a bearable pace. We see echoes of this in the meticulous, peer-reviewed release of findings from the Event Horizon Telescope on black holes, or the slow, methodical decoding of data from Voyager and Cassini, a practice that normalizes the extraordinary through the ritual of academic scrutiny. Yet, does this carefully orchestrated cadence risk creating an illusion of control in a situation that may, by its very nature, be fundamentally uncontrollable? Are we building a dam of discourse that could be shattered by a single, undeniable event? Ultimately, at the scale of civilization, this endeavor represents a profound and unprecedented project: the construction of a global, cognitive immune system, a capacity for epistemic hygiene in preparation for future contact. It is a grand exercise in building resilience, not against physical invasion, but against the virulent memes of cosmic nihilism or theological collapse. By managing the 3I divided by Atlas narrative with such deliberate care, institutions like NATO may be attempting to inoculate the collective human consciousness to strengthen our cultural antibodies before we are exposed to a pathogen of ideas for which we have no natural defense. This is the ultimate maturation of a species, to look into the abyss without losing its mind. But in cultivating this resilience, do we not also run the profound risk of fostering an overprotective, paternalistic culture that stifles the very creative and disruptive thinking that might be essential to truly comprehend, or even respond to, what we have found? Could our desire for stability become the very cage that prevents our next evolutionary leap? The implications of this perspective are, as vast as they are unsettling. The positive outcome is the potential for a collective maturation, a guided transition into a new cosmic reality that avoids the societal trauma once imagined by early thinkers on the subject of contact. It is the dream of a managed enlightenment, a controlled burn that clears the undergrowth of archaic belief without igniting a global conflagration. The negative outcome, however, is a civilization that has been so thoroughly insulated from shock that it loses its capacity for wonder, its appetite for the raw, untamed truth of the cosmos, trading the terrifying freedom of the unknown for the placid security of a curated reality. Have we, in our desire to avoid panic, engineered a world where the most profound discovery in history is met not with awe, but with a comfortably numb acceptance? Thus, the true role of the sentinels at the threshold may be far more complex than mere planetary defense. They are the gatekeepers of human sanity, the architects of a narrative so immense that its telling must be measured in generations, not news cycles. They are not just shielding us from a hypothetical external threat, but from the internal schism that the mere confirmation of that threat would inevitably cause. This reframing turns the entire enterprise inward, forcing us to question whether the greatest challenge of first contact will be understanding the other, or understanding ourselves. And so, we are left to ponder the ultimate consequence of this grand, psychological safeguard. Does it prepare us for a dialogue with the stars, or does it merely condition us to receive a monologue, delivered on terms we can psychologically withstand, forever placing us in the role of the patient listener, rather than an equal participant in a cosmic conversation? For if 3I divided by Atlas is indeed a non-human intelligence, then the protocols enacted now will determine nothing less than the future tenor of human existence, a future where the first voice to speak for Earth may not be that of a scientist or a philosopher, but that of a soldier trained in the art of cognitive calm. And in that moment of first contact, will our carefully maintained stability be seen as wisdom or as the ultimate vulnerability? The first click of the reply button, a gesture so mundane in our terrestrial affairs, echoes here with the weight of epochs. It is a gesture that could sculpt the trajectory of the next 1,000 years, a single, deliberate act of a cosmic conversation that might either herald an unprecedented renaissance for our species or set in motion consequences we are, as of yet, too fledgling to comprehend. The signal, designated 3I divided by Atlas, is not merely a collection of photons and radio waves, it is a key, hovering before a lock we have only just begun to imagine. And in this pivotal moment, the power to turn that key does not rest with a global consensus of philosophers or scientists, but appears to be coalescing within the strategic, and some might say, terrestrial, command structures of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The question is no longer if we are alone, but who, precisely, shall speak for Earth when we break our collective silence. Could the very nature of our first interstellar handshake be dictated by the same alliance forged for the geopolitical realities of a single fragile world? The architecture of a first contact message has long been a subject of theoretical exercise, a chess game played with the fundamental pieces of mathematics and physics. The mainstream scientific community, through decades of METI, messaging to extraterrestrial intelligence, and SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence, protocols, has meticulously drafted blueprints for a universal greeting. The logic is impeccably rational, to employ a language that transcends the parochialisms of human culture. The prime number sequence, a counting of 1, 3, 5, 7, 11, a pattern that stands as a silent, immutable truth against the noise of the cosmos, a beacon declaring artifice and intention. The pulsar map, a celestial cartography using the steady, predictable beats of neutron stars as galactic landmarks, pinpointing our solar system's location with a precision that could be decoded across light years. This is the established lexicon, a grammar built upon the constants of the universe, designed to convey a simple, hopeful message. We are here, and we are rational. But does this carefully constructed vocabulary of primes and pulsars truly prepare us for the content of a message we did not draft? A message that might carry within it not just a hello, but a library, a warning, or a test. This leads us to the first, and perhaps most audacious, speculative hypothesis, that 3I divided by Atlas is not merely a complex signal, but a standardized greeting protocol, a kind of cosmic handshake designed for nascent intelligences. Perhaps it contains not only the universal language of mathematics, but a more profound and unsettling component, a minimal ethical code for contact. Imagine a set of axiomatic statements, logical propositions, outlining the bare necessities for peaceful dialogue between intelligences, a foundational ethics derived not from human sentiment, but from the cold, a hard logic of survival and cooperation in a potentially dangerous universe. The prime numbers establish a baseline for intelligence. The pulsar map establishes a shared physical context, but an embedded ethical code would aim to establish a framework for a safe and sustainable relationship. It would be a mirror held up to our own civilization, asking us to define ourselves not by what we have achieved, but by the principles we are willing to universally uphold. What if the first test from the stars is not one of intellect, but of character? The argument for a coordinated, disciplined response finds a compelling, if controversial, advocate in the structure of a military alliance like NATO. From a purely logistical and strategic standpoint, the challenges of managing humanity's response are staggering. We must consider the technical dimension, the selection of the precise frequency for reply, perhaps the hydrogen line or the water hole, those quiet windows in the electromagnetic spectrum where the universe seems to listen, the calculation of the immense power required to punch a signal back across the interstellar void, a task demanding resources on a national scale, the design of an encoding scheme robust enough to survive the journey and complex enough to convey meaningful information. A fragmented, cacophonous response from 100 competing nations and private entities would be the antithesis of clarity, a Tower of Babel aimed at the stars. A single powerful and coherent signal, managed by an entity with the organizational capacity to enforce radio silence and coordinate a global effort, presents a far more disciplined and arguably safer front. But does efficiency and discipline in transmission necessarily equate to wisdom in content? Can a military alliance, honed for terrestrial conflict, be trusted to compose a message representing the totality of human aspiration? This brings us to the second, more profound level of analysis, the political. In the vacuum of any established interstellar law, the question of who holds the authority to represent humanity is not just philosophical, it is intensely, immediately practical. There is no United Nations Charter for first contact, no galactic senate to appeal to. The very act of replying is an act of representation, a declaration that the sender speaks for the species. The mainstream, optimistic view would hope for a global consortium, a panel of our finest minds from every field and nation, crafting a message that embodies our collective hopes. Yet, the reality of international politics suggests that power, not consensus, often fills a vacuum. NATO, with its integrated command structure, its history of managing crises, and its access to the most advanced surveillance and communication technologies on the planet, is uniquely positioned to seize the initiative. They could argue, persuasively, that in the face of an unknown and potentially existential variable, a chain of command is preferable to a debating society. But does this pragmatic argument conceal a more troubling reality, that the power to speak for Earth could be monopolized by a single powerful bloc, projecting its own political and cultural biases into the cosmos, as if they were the voice of humanity itself? Thus, we are compelled to consider a more unsettling hypothesis, that the greatest risk of first contact is not the alien other, but the consolidation of ultimate power among ourselves. The ability to control the narrative of contact, to curate the information released to the public, to shape humanity's self-perception and our galactic identity, would be a form of power unprecedented in history. The entity that controls the transmission also controls the reception. It becomes the sole interpreter, the gatekeeper of cosmic truth. The reply message would inevitably reflect the values and strategic interests of its senders. Would it be a message of open curiosity and peaceful intent, or one couched in the language of caution, strength, and territorial sovereignty, effectively projecting the old, divisive maps of Earth onto the canvas of the galaxy? Is the first contact scenario not a meeting with another intelligence, but the catalyst for the final and most absolute form of governance ever conceived on our planet? This leads inexorably to the third and most profound level of our inquiry, the civilizational. We are forced to confront the minimal ethical standards not just of a potential message, but of our own species. What are the core, non-negotiable principles we would wish to convey? The sanctity of life? The pursuit of knowledge? A commitment to non-aggression? The mainstream scientific approach has, understandably, shied away from such nebulous concepts, focusing on the concrete and the calculable. Yet, if the speculative hypothesis holds any water, the 3I divided by Atlas signal might be forcing this very issue upon us. It may be presenting us with a framework, a set of rules for engagement that we must either accept or reject. To engage in this dialogue is to step onto a stage where our every action, our every transmission, will be judged against a standard we did not set. The optimistic outcome is the birth of a true, professional interstellar diplomacy, a field that merges the rigor of science with the nuance of statecraft, elevating humanity to a new level of cosmic maturity. But this path is fraught with the risk of creating a monolithic voice for humanity, a voice that may speak of peace while being governed by structures designed for war. Will our first foray into the galactic community be as a unified, enlightened species, or as a planet whose most powerful faction has simply learned to speak for everyone? The vision that emerges is one of profound duality. On one hand, we see the potential for a positive future, the formation of a dedicated, expert-led, interstellar diplomacy, a collective human project that could finally unite our species under a shared, cosmic destiny. The very act of replying to 3I divided by Atlas, if done correctly, could force upon us a unity we have never before achieved. On the other hand, the risk is the monopolization of humanity's voice, the concentration of unimaginable soft and hard power in the hands of a select few who will decide what parts of the truth are revealed and what narratives are constructed for public consumption. The reply button is not just a switch for a transmitter, it is the trigger for a new human epoch. Will the story of our first contact be one of open collaboration, or will it be the ultimate expression of control, where the truths of the universe become the classified assets of a power block and the destiny of humanity is negotiated in secret, under the guise of strategic security? And so, as we stand at this precipice, the silence from the stars is met with a growing, calculated silence on Earth, a silence that speaks not of absence, but of profound and deliberate choice. For if the power to reply has been claimed, then so too has the power to conceal, to filter, and to shape the very reality of this event. For the billions who look to the skies with wonder, the decision of what to say is irrevocably tied to the decision of what not to say. Silence, it can be a shield, and it can be a shackle. In the vast, whispering library of the cosmos, where every pulsar is a rhythmic footnote, and every distant galaxy a chapter in an epic still being written, the most profound statement is often the one not made. It is the void between the stars, the pause between radio pulses, the unspoken conclusion in a scientific report. When the Pan-STARRS Observatory in Hawaii and the star-mapping Gaia mission of the European Space Agency first registered the anomalous trajectory of the object, designated 3I divided by Atlas, the data streams did not flow into the public domain with their customary placid regularity. Instead, they encountered a dam, a deliberate and meticulously constructed silence emanating from the highest echelons of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of profound, calculated knowledge. One must then ponder, is this strategic reticence a necessary protocol for survival in a universe whose rules we are only beginning to dimly apprehend, or does it mark the genesis of a new, unassailable hegemony over cosmic truth, a permanent filter placed between humanity and the heavens? The mainstream scientific explanation for such a measured response is rooted in the cold, hard calculus of risk management and societal stability. According to current models of crisis psychology and information theory, the uncontrolled release of paradigm-shattering data can trigger societal schisms, economic collapse, and a fatal erosion of the very institutions that enable coherent, rational response. We have historical precedents. The delayed and carefully managed announcements regarding the Oumuamua interstellar object were predicated on this very principle to allow the global scientific community to build a consensus, to run the data through the peer review gauntlet, and to present findings with a degree of certainty that prevents public hysteria. Scientists suggest this could be due to the innate human tendency to pattern match, to ascribe agency and intent to the unknown, a cognitive relic from our evolutionary past that is ill-suited for processing the truly alien. The initial silence, therefore, is a buffer, a temporal quarantine, allowing for the development of intellectual antibodies before the pathogen of raw, uncontextualized information is released into the body politic. But does this paternalistic model, designed for a world of terrestrial threats, hold its integrity when applied to a phenomenon that exists entirely outside our terrestrial frame of reference, an object that has traversed the interstellar void to enter our celestial neighborhood? This leads us to a more speculative and perhaps more unsettling hypothesis: the implementation of what might be termed the three-filter rule. Under this clandestine protocol, every fragment of data concerning 3I divided by atlas must pass through 3 distinct and sequential gateways before it is deemed fit for public consumption. The first is the technical filter, where raw data from the James Webb Space Telescope's NIRS spec instrument and the Doppler shift analyses from the Deep Space Network are scrubbed for errors, artifacts, and instrumental noise, a standard, if rigorous, scientific process. The second is the security filter, a domain where analysts versed in orbital mechanics and potential threat assessment evaluate the object's capabilities, its composition inferred from spectroscopic lines of hydrogen and other elements, and its potential for manipulation or aggression. It is at this stage that the language of science begins to morph into the lexicon of strategy. Yet, it is the third and most profound filter that represents a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with knowledge, the cognitive filter. Here, the question is no longer, what is this data? But, what will this data times do times to the human mind? Will the revelation of a non-natural isotopic ratio, or a surface geometry defying known material science, shatter foundational pillars of physics, religion, and philosophy? This tripartite gauntlet transforms data from a pure commodity of enlightenment into a controlled substance, its dosage and timing meticulously managed. But if knowledge is the very medium in which a civilization evolves, what becomes of a species that accepts a curated, sanitized version of its own reality, even if that curation is performed with the most benevolent of intentions? The evidence from past crises provides a starkly dualistic testimony to the efficacy and peril of such an approach. The history of pandemics, of financial collapses, and of environmental disasters demonstrates unequivocally that a temporary, strategic delay in information dissemination can provide a critical window for authorities to formulate a coherent response, to marshal resources, and to prevent a descent into chaotic, individualistic panic. The initial silence surrounding the Chernobyl disaster, though morally reprehensible in its duration, was nonetheless an attempt, however flawed, to maintain operational control. The same principle, scaled to a cosmic level, could be argued for 3I divided by Atlas. A premature announcement could trigger a global stock market crash, a run on resources, or a catastrophic failure of international cooperation, as nations turn inward, prioritizing their own survival over a collective human response. The delay is a gambit, a wager that the short-term erosion of trust is a price worth paying for the long-term preservation of civilizational stability. Yet, this very strategy contains the seeds of its own potential downfall, for a trust that is repeatedly broken does not merely erode, it evaporates, leaving behind a vacuum to be filled by conspiracy, cynicism, and anarchy. How many layers of silence can the delicate fabric of public trust endure before it tears irreparably, leaving us not with a unified humanity facing the cosmos, but with a fractured, suspicious planet incapable of a shared destiny? To fully comprehend the ramifications, we must analyze this silence across three distinct temporal horizons, each with its own cascade of consequences. In the short term, the immediate goal is noise reduction and panic avoidance. By controlling the narrative from its inception, agencies can prevent the signal of genuine discovery from being drowned in a cacophony of amateur speculation, sensationalist media, and digital misinformation. This creates a sterile field in which experts can operate, free from the distorting pressures of public opinion and political grandstanding. It is the application of a scientific principle to the societal organism: isolate the variable to understand it. But in creating this sterile field, do we not also sterilize the vibrant, chaotic, and often brilliantly intuitive ecosystem of global collective intelligence, potentially blinding ourselves to interpretations that lie outside the consensus of a cloistered elite? In the medium term, spanning months, or perhaps a few years, a more insidious cultural shift begins to take root, the cultivation of a pervasive culture of suspicion. As the gap between the known and the revealed widens, as leaks are contradicted by official statements, and the three-filter rule is intuited if not confirmed, the public psyche undergoes a fundamental change. The citizenry transforms from passive recipients of information into active, and often paranoid, detectives. Every press release is scrutinized for subtext, every omission is seen as a confirmation of hidden knowledge, and the scientific establishment itself becomes viewed not as a beacon of objectivity, but as an arm of the state's security apparatus. This cultural schism does not merely create two groups, the trusting and the skeptical. It creates two parallel realities, each with its own set of facts and its own narrative of the event. Is a civilization, fractured into 1,000 competing conspiracies, any more stable than one plunged into a brief, sharp shock of unvarnished truth? The long-term consequence, unfolding over decades, is the most profound and structurally permanent: the establishment of a systemic mechanism for the control of knowledge itself. What begins as an emergency protocol for a specific anomaly can, through precedent and bureaucratic inertia, become a permanent feature of our epistemological landscape. A new branch of governance, operating in the shadows, would be tasked with deciding what humanity is, and is not, ready to know. The discoveries of future telescopes, the analysis of future interstellar interlopers, the very search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, would all fall under this purview. Knowledge of the cosmos would no longer be a human right, a shared inheritance, but a classified asset, its distribution determined by criteria of security and social stability. This is not merely the control of information, it is the control of the human horizon, the deliberate limitation of our collective imagination and ambition. Could we, in our quest to protect ourselves from the shock of the new, inadvertently architect our own intellectual stagnation, building a comfortable, well-lit prison of the mind from which the stars are forever out of reach? The ultimate outcome of this strategic silence is thus a civilization standing at a crossroads, facing a warning of dual nature. The positive path suggests that by tempering the raw disruptive power of a first contact scenario, we grant ourselves the precious gift of time to deliberate with calm reason, to forge unprecedented international alliances, and to make decisions based on long-term strategy rather than short-term fear. It is the application of wisdom over instinct. The negative path, however, leads to a gradual, almost imperceptible dimming of our cosmic awareness. We would become a civilization that knows less and less about its own sky, not through a lack of data, but through an excess of curation. The great questions of our place in the universe would be answered not by philosophers and physicists, but by anonymous committees whose primary metric is not truth, but control. And so, we are left with the most haunting question of all. In our desire to shield ourselves from the blinding light of a terrifying truth, will we ultimately choose to dwell in a twilight of our own making, forever wondering what magnificent or monstrous realities we would deem too fragile to behold? For the answers, perhaps, lie not in the silence itself, but in the events it precipitates, in the hushed corridors of power where the fate of human knowledge was decided in a single, clandestine gathering, a gathering prompted by a data update that changed everything. What truly transpired during that extraordinary convocation? The emergency session convened in the dead of night, where the world's most powerful defense alliance confronted the implications of an object that should not exist. The celestial vault, for all its perceived constancy, is a manuscript written in the language of motion and light, a text we have only just begun to decipher. For centuries, humanity has charted its courses, mapping the predictable ballet of planets and the stately procession of stars, building a comforting Newtonian clockwork of the heavens. This ordered tranquility was, however, profoundly disrupted by the arrival of an uninvited guest, the interstellar object designated 3I divided by Atlas. Its initial detection was a moment of pure scientific exhilaration, a confirmation that the building blocks of other star systems were now within our observational grasp. Yet, the trajectory of this curiosity was about to veer from the halls of academia into the secured situation rooms of global power. For 3I divided by Atlas had just executed a maneuver that defied its assigned role as a mere inert wanderer, leaping from the map of the normal sky, and in doing so, triggering an urgent, clandestine convening of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The question, hanging heavy in the air, was not merely one of orbital mechanics, but of profound implication. Why would a celestial body, a piece of cosmic driftwood, to possess the capacity to bend the schedule of the world's most powerful military alliance, redirecting the focus of admirals and generals from terrestrial disputes to a single point of light in the deep black? The mainstream scientific explanation, as proposed in initial, cautiously worded bulletins, pointed towards a series of outgassing events. According to current models, as a comet-like body approaches the Sun, the increasing solar radiation heats its frozen volatiles, causing them to sublimate and jet into space. These natural jets can act as thrusters, imparting small, non-gravitational forces that subtly alter the object's path. The data from pan-stars, which meticulously track such objects, showed an unusually dense frequency of these required orbital corrections, a fitful, jerky dance rather than a smooth, gravitational curve. Simultaneously, the European Space Agency's data streams recorded fleeting, almost stroboscopic changes in the object's brightness, patterns that some analysts compared to the signature of a rigid body rotation, a tumbling motion that could, in theory, produce asymmetric outgassing. This, the official narrative suggested, was a particularly dynamic and complex example of a natural phenomenon, a rogue iceberg from another star, cracking and venting its ancient gases under a foreign Sunday. But that explanation, for all its comforting familiarity, fails to account for the precision and the timing of these alterations, which seemed less like the random belches of a melting snowball and more like a series of deliberate, calculated course corrections. What if the outgassing hypothesis is merely a palatable veneer over a far more unsettling reality, a reality where 3I divided by Atlas is not a passive object, but an active agent, a beacon or command node for an extraterrestrial sensor network, awakening from its long interstellar journey as it crosses the threshold into a region of space deemed interesting, perhaps even inhabited? Or perhaps it is a probe in the truest sense of the word, a von Neumann architect following a pre-programmed protocol that triggers a specific suite of actions, a waking up sequence. Upon entering the gravitational and electromagnetic sphere of a technologically nascent world, its anomalous maneuvers not random but diagnostic, testing the waters of a new stellar neighborhood. The evidence, when pieced together outside the constraints of conservative consensus, begins to form a mosaic of profound ambiguity. The team at the Center for Astrophysics, Vertical Bar, Harvard and Smithsonian had, in prior years, published a minor but persistent annotation in their studies of interstellar objects, a consistent, minuscule deviation from purely Newtonian predictions, a ghost in the orbital machine. At the time, it was a curiosity, a footnote for future theoreticians to resolve. Now, with 3I divided by Atlas, this minor anomaly was no longer an academic trifle. It had escalated into the central datum of a global security consultation. The confluence of the erratic orbital adjustments from pan-stars, the anomalous light curve data from the ESA, and this historical context of small but consistent deviations was a triad of circumstantial evidence that proved sufficient to cross a threshold. It was no longer just a matter for astronomers, it had become a matter for strategists. The very laws of physics, as we understand them, seem to be bending around this visitor, and in that bending, the foundations of our geopolitical order began to tremble. Could it be that we are witnessing not a failure of our models, but the operation of a technology that operates just beyond the pale of our current physical theories, a physics that treats gravity not as a master, but as a medium to be manipulated? This interpretation of the data, this leap from celestial mechanics to potential first contact, necessitated a response that was as layered and complex as the anomaly itself. The analysis and the subsequent actions unfolded across three distinct, escalating tiers, a carefully choreographed dance between observation and preparation. At the most immediate, local level, within the secure communications networks of NATO, the response was one of informational and bureaucratic recalibration. Standard operating procedures for space situational awareness were abruptly updated, their classification levels elevated. A direct, encrypted scientific military hotline was established, a channel where astrophysicists from the ESA and military analysts from Allied command operations could share data in real time, translating the language of arcseconds and magnitude into the language of threat assessment and strategic implication. This was the creation of a new lexicon for a new type of crisis, one where a telescope's observation could carry the same weight as a radar blip. But infusing the cultures of open scientific inquiry and closed-door military secrecy, what new hybrid of knowledge and power are we creating, and to what ultimate end? The response then expanded to the regional level, a phase characterized by a silent, global intensification of vigilance. A coordinated, 24/7 surveillance regime was instituted, a global net of eyes cast skyward. Radio telescopes from Arecibo's successors to the Deep Space Network focused their immense dishes on the object, not merely tracking its position, but listening, intently listening, across the entire electromagnetic spectrum for any hint of structured transmission. Secret, unpublicized drills were conducted, simulating urgent communication protocols between far-flung radar installations in Thule and Fylingdales and the great optical and radio observatories of the world. These were not war games in the traditional sense, but something far more profound: contact games. They were rehearsals for a conversation with the unknown, a silent ballet of data fusion aiming to pinpoint the exact nature of this celestial intruder. If this is a probe, does it now know it is being watched with an intensity we usually reserve for hostile missiles, and what might it learn from the pattern of our own frantic, coordinated gaze? Finally, at the most profound, systemic level, a conceptual shift occurred within the highest echelons of power. 3. I divided by Atlas was no longer classified merely as a potentially hazardous object, but was quietly recategorized under a new experimental protocol, that of an intelligence-triggering celestial event. This was a paradigm shift of Copernican proportions. It was the formal, if clandestine, acknowledgement that the universe might not only be inhabited, but that its inhabitants might be capable of direct, deliberate interaction. This triggered a secretive review and testing of long-dormant protocols for extraterrestrial contact, dusty UN documents suddenly infused with terrifying immediacy. The very rules of engagement, conceived for a world of human adversaries, were now being stress-tested against a non-human actor whose motives, capabilities, and very nature were complete mysteries. In preparing for a dialogue with an intelligence that may operate on timescales and with a logic utterly alien to our own, are we not forced to confront the profound limitations of our own political and psychological frameworks? Frameworks built for a solitary world, suddenly finding itself in a crowded neighborhood. The outcomes of this unprecedented convergence of science and security present a dual-faced coin, offering both a gleaming opportunity and a tarnished risk. The opportunity is historic, the chance to forge a permanent, deeply integrated science-security partnership at a level never before attempted. The crisis of 3, I divided by Atlas, has, in effect, broken down the silos that have long separated the astronomical community from the intelligence and defense communities, creating a conduit for the free flow of the most cutting-edge cosmological discoveries into the rooms where global policy is shaped. This fusion could, in theory, elevate our entire species' capacity to understand and navigate the cosmos, uniting our best minds with our most robust institutions in a common, transcendent purpose. Yet, the attendant risk is the shadow cast by this new alliance, the perilous precedent of the militarization of astronomical discovery. When a new comet or asteroid is no longer just a scientific prize but a potential security threat, the instinct will be to classify, to control, to hide. The open, collaborative spirit that has driven scientific progress for centuries could be suffocated under layers of state secrecy, and the profound knowledge that belongs to all of humanity could be locked away in vaults, deemed too dangerous for public consumption. The very transparency needed to foster global trust and make informed decisions about our place in the universe could be the first casualty in this new, silent, Cold War, not between nations, but between humanity and the great, dark, unknown. As we stand at this crossroads, balancing the promise of unified knowledge against the peril of state-controlled truth, one must wonder which path will ultimately define our future, and whether the very act of preparing for a secretive universe might inevitably force us to become more secretive ourselves. And as the initial shock of the object's anomalous behavior began to settle into a new, tense routine of global surveillance, a more disquieting question began to circulate in the most secure briefings. What if the most telling data about 3I divided by Atlas did not come from our telescopes pointed outward, but from our own military infrastructure designed to watch each other? For the secure, channels were about to be compromised by a truth too volatile to be contained, a truth hinted at, not by astronomers, but by the silent, ever-vigilant sentinels of our own orbital borders. The carefully constructed official narrative, already strained, was on the verge of shattering entirely, as whispers of a catastrophic intelligence breach began to surface, carrying with them the ominous implication that our own early warning systems had seen something in the visitor's wake that the scientists, in their purity of purpose, had missed. What terrifying consensus, forged in the silent language of radar returns and satellite telemetry, could have so galvanized the highest levels of NATO command that they would feel compelled to treat this speck of interstellar rock and ice not as a scientific curiosity, but as a clear and present danger. In the silent digital catacombs where the world's most sensitive data is entombed, a single file, marked with the stark, uncompromising label of "No Fawn, not for foreign dissemination," has slipped its cryptographic leash. This was not a mere document, but a seismic tremor in the foundation of our perceived reality, a ripple in the placid surface of our cosmic solitude. The subject of this breach is designated 3I divided by Atlas, a cryptic identifier now elevated from an obscure data point to a non-conventional threat of the highest order within the secure briefing rooms of NATO's Supreme Command. The very nature of this classification suggests an entity or a phenomenon that defies the established taxonomies of warfare, a thing that cannot be countered by aircraft carrier groups or intercontinental ballistic missiles. It is a ghost in the machine of global security, a whisper in the static that has compelled the most advanced surveillance architecture ever conceived by humanity to sound a silent, desperate alarm. What manner of signal, what peculiar signature, could so thoroughly unnerve the cold, logical heart of our planetary defense systems? The mainstream explanation, the first and most comforting layer of analysis, would point to the immense and ever-increasing sensitivity of our orbital sentinels. According to current models, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, with its network of ground-based radars and space-based infrared sensors, is perpetually tuned to the faintest whispers of the cosmos, capable of distinguishing the heat signature of a booster rocket from the ambient background radiation of the universe. It is plausible, scientists suggest, that this alert was triggered by an anomalous but natural event, a series of micrometeoroid impacts on a key satellite, creating a rhythmic pattern of debris, or a hitherto unobserved atmospheric phenomenon, a kind of upper atmospheric lightning known as a sprite, or ELV, discharging in a regular, clockwork pulse that mimicked an artificial signal. The U.S. NATO Early Warning Satellite Network has a long and documented history of recording such luminous atmospheric anomalies, their databases filled with glitches and ghosts that are, almost invariably, explained away by known physics. The very groups tasked with tracking near-Earth objects are perpetually vigilant for asteroids with unpredictable trajectories, their warnings a routine part of securing our orbital and planetary space. This framework of rational vigilance provides a ready-made, sanitized box in which to place the unsettling nature of the 3I divided by Atlas alert, legitimizing the security apparatus's response as one of prudent, if heightened, caution. But what if the signal was not a glitch, nor a known natural event, but something else entirely? The speculative hypothesis, born from the gaps in the conventional narrative, paints a far more profound and disquieting picture. What if NORAD's arrays, in their ceaseless sweep, intercepted a periodic ping, a sequence of pulses so regular, so pristine in its mathematical purity, that it resembled the ticking of a radio clock built by an intelligence utterly alien to our own? Or perhaps it was the orbital surveillance satellites that captured the evidence, not a burst of light, but a faint, impossibly thin plasma trail, a filament of energized particles lingering in the vacuum, the unmistakable and silent wake of a propulsion system that operates on principles beyond our comprehension of chemical rocketry. Such a signature would indicate a vessel, or a probe, moving under controlled power, a technology that has mastered the vacuum of space with an elegance and efficiency that renders our own explosive, fuel-gulping engines primitive by comparison. This is not the stuff of radar ghosts or sensor malfunctions. This is the signature of a craftsman, and the craft is unknown. Does the 3I divided by Atlas file, then, contain not just a warning, but the first fragmented blueprint of a technology that redefines the very laws of motion? The technical analysis undertaken in the wake of this discovery would have been conducted in the sterile, hushed environments of laboratories buried deep beneath mountains, a multi-tiered dissection of the anomaly. At the first level, the engineering response, a frantic, yet meticulously controlled, increase in the sensitivity of microwave channels across the global listening network, a narrowing of focus onto specific, suspect frequency bands, particularly those surrounding the hallowed hydrogen line at 1,420 MHz, the universal watering hole for any civilization hoping to be heard. The Doppler shift of the signal would be analyzed not for the orbital velocity of a satellite, but for velocities that speak of journeys between worlds. The second tier, the strategic assessment, would move beyond the signal itself to contemplate its implications for the fragile web of our modern civilization. Wargame simulations would be run, modeling scenarios of catastrophic satellite communication failure, of GPS networks going dark, of the sudden, silent severing of the global information nerve system. The question would no longer be, what is it, but what can it do? Could this entity, whether probe or presence, inadvertently or intentionally, plunge our interconnected world into a new dark age simply by its proximity or its emissions? This leads inexorably to the third and most profound level of analysis, the doctrinal. In the hallowed halls where nuclear deterrent strategy was born, a new, unsettling term would be drafted into the lexicon: the non-national object. This is an entity with the capability to impact the delicate, hair-trigger balance of mutual assured destruction, yet it owes allegiance to no flag, recognizes no borders, and is utterly immune to the threats and promises that have kept a precarious peace among nations for decades. How does a superpower deter a phenomenon? How does a military alliance like NATO formulate a response to a potential intelligence that may not even recognize its existence, let alone its authority? The very foundations of geopolitical power, painstakingly constructed over centuries, are rendered suddenly, terrifyingly obsolete. Does the arrival or the awakening of 3I divided by Atlas signal not a new enemy but the end of the game itself? The potential outcomes of this revelation bifurcate into two starkly divergent paths, a fork in the road for humanity's future. On one hand, the positive, a forced and rapid standardization of protocols for handling anomalous signals, an unprecedented international collaboration in data sharing and analysis, a golden age for the science of astrobiology and SETI, born from the urgent need to understand. It could be the catalyst that finally unites our species in a common cosmic cause. Yet, the negative path is a descent into chaos. The controlled leak of a no-fawn file is one thing. A full, unredacted data dump into the public sphere would be another entirely. The psychological impact on a global populace, unprepared for such a fundamental challenge to Cambridge. their worldview, could be catastrophic. The ensuing panic, the erosion of trust in institutions, the rapid metastasis of conspiracy theories that would choke out rational scientific inquiry. This is the shadow that 3I Divided by Atlas casts. The greatest threat may not be the signal itself, but our own fractured and fearful reaction to it. Will this be the moment that elevates us, or the shock that shatters our global society beyond repair? And as the highest echelons of power scramble to contain the breach and comprehend the incomprehensible, a new, unprecedented gathering is quietly convened behind soundproof doors, a meeting that in itself reveals the truly multidimensional nature of the crisis. For the first time, the battle-hardened generals of NATO, whose expertise lies in the art of terrestrial warfare, find themselves seated at the same table with the astrophysicists and astronomers, the poets of cosmic radiation and the cartographers of space-time, their starkly different worldviews forced into a desperate collaboration. What truths will be spoken in that room, and what new, even more terrifying hypotheses will be born from the confluence of military pragmatism and scientific wonder, as the enigmatic faces of power and knowledge turn their collective gaze towards the same silent threat in the void. The room was a study in contrasts, a silent testament to the unprecedented nature of the event. Around the monolithic, obsidian table, the crisp, sharp lines of military dress uniforms, adorned with the insignia of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, sat adjacent to the soft, textured wool of academic cardigans. There were no windows. The only illumination came from the cool, pervasive glow of a single, vast screen dominating one wall, upon which the designation 3I Divided by Atlas hung, a cryptic sigil against the star-dusted void. This was not a casual symposium, nor a routine briefing. It was a confluence of two worlds that had, for centuries, largely orbited separate suns: the world of geopolitical strategy and terrestrial power, and the world of cosmic contemplation and fundamental inquiry. Their shared gaze, fixed upon those 7 characters, suggested a paradigm shift of a magnitude not seen since the dawn of the atomic age. What common gravity could pull these disparate orbits into such a tense, singular alignment? According to established protocols, the appearance of an interstellar object should have been a matter primarily for the scientific community. Agencies like NASA, the European Space Agency, and the European Southern Observatory have well-rehearsed choreographies for such events, built upon decades of tracking near-Earth objects. The data streams spectroscopic analyses from the Very Large Telescope, radar pings from the Goldstone Deep Space Network, the faint whisper of microwave emissions would typically flow through academic channels, vetted and published for global scrutiny in a spirit of open inquiry. This existing framework, a testament to international scientific cooperation, is designed to classify, to understand, to place a new datum within the grand, if incomplete, catalogue of celestial mechanics. Yet, the simultaneous presence of 4-star generals and astrophysicists in a secured chamber hints that 3I Divided by Atlas has been immediately recognized as something that defies such neat categorization. Does its trajectory through our solar system represent not just a physical path, but a challenge to our very structures of knowledge and power? Thus, the first and most profound hypothesis emerges from this forced collaboration, the clandestine formation of an Times Interstellar Catalyst Committee *. This would be no ordinary working group. It would be an entity granted unprecedented supraclassification authority to analyze the anomaly in real time, its mandate cutting across the bureaucratic iron curtains that traditionally separate national defense from fundamental science. Its purpose would be catalytic to accelerate humanity's response, to synthesize disparate data points into a coherent strategy at a pace demanded by the object's fleeting passage. The very existence of such a committee implies that the highest echelons of power have conceded that no single domain of human expertise is sufficient to comprehend what approaches. But what catalytic reaction is being sought, one of understanding or one of preemption? The precedent for such a fusion exists, albeit in a more limited form. The planetary defense coordination efforts against potentially hazardous asteroids demonstrate that when a clear physical threat is perceived, the military-industrial complex and the scientific academy can indeed find a common language. The Doppler shift of a rogue asteroid is a universal vocabulary of momentum and impact. But 3I divided by Atlas is not simply a rock on a collision course. Its anomalies, its potential artificiality, or at the very least, its profound unnaturalness, elevate it from a problem of orbital dynamics to one of existential interpretation. This necessitates an expansion of the collaborative structure, pushing it beyond the exchange of orbital telemetry and into the murkier waters of information, theory, and semiotics. If the standard protocols for a NEO are a simple handshake, what new, complex lexicon must be invented for an event that speaks in riddles? The analysis, therefore, must operate on 3 escalating and interwoven levels. The first is the foundational layer of pure data exchange, the synchronization of spectral readings from the James Webb Space Telescope with radar imaging from Arecibo's successors and the persistent hum of its microwave output. This tripartite sensory assault aims to build a physical model of the object, to understand its composition, its structure, its emission properties. Scientists would suggest this could be due to a novel form of interstellar geology, a conglomerate of ices and dust forged in an alien stellar nursery. Its strange emissions, the result of complex chemistry, under conditions we can only model in supercomputers. But what natural process could account for the coherence of its signal, the tantalizing patterns in its radio output that seem to dance on the very edge of mathematical regularity? This leads inexorably to the second level, the interdisciplinary fusion. Here, the dynamics of celestial motion, calculated with the precise laws of Kepler and Newton, are merged with the emergent sciences of cybersecurity and information strategy. The object's trajectory is not merely a line in space, it is a vector of data, a potential carrier of code. Network theorists and cryptographers would sit alongside orbital mechanicians, their combined expertise treating 3I divided by Atlas, not as a passive body, but as an active node. The mainstream explanation might posit that any perceived structure in its transmissions is a form of pareidolia, a human tendency to impose order on cosmic noise, amplified by the sheer volume of data. However, certain anomalies, specific prime number sequences in signal intervals, or resonant frequencies aligned with the hydrogen line, defy all conventional explanations rooted in natural astrophysical processes, suggesting a source that is either artificially crafted or originates from a natural environment so alien it is indistinguishable from design. And from this precipice, the third and most profound level of analysis emerges, the formulation of a species-wide protocol. This is the realm of the cosmic linguist, the speculative philosopher, the exosociologist roles once confined to university seminars, now granted a seat at the most critical table on the planet. The committee's most radical act, a testament to the depth of their perplexity, would be to invite a pioneer of xenolinguistics onto the team. Their task would not be to translate, but to first establish if a syntax, a grammar, or even a conceptual framework for communication exists within the data stream. This moves the inquiry from "what is it?" to "what does it intend?" Could the very structure of its transmission be a kind of Turing test for an entire civilization, a first filter to separate the signal listeners from the message comprehenders? The ramifications of this unprecedented collaboration are a double-edged sword, presenting both a golden opportunity and a profound risk. The opportunity is for science itself, a sudden, massive influx of funding and political will, catapulting fields like radio astronomy, particle physics, and xenolinguistics into a new golden age. Telescopes would be built, probes launched, and computing resources allocated on a scale previously unimaginable, all in service of understanding this one object. It is the kind of catalyzing event that could unify human scientific endeavor for a generation. But does this scientific windfall come at the cost of its soul, when the primary funder wears a uniform and the primary goal shifts from understanding to threat assessment? The risk is the subtle, perhaps inevitable, militarization of the unknown. As the military and intelligence apparatus places its priorities upon the committee's work, the foundational principles of open data sharing the very engine of modern scientific progress risk being curtailed. Findings once destined for argziv.org would be stamped top secret. independent verification by the global academic community would become impossible. The quest for understanding would be forced into the shadows, its conclusions shaped by the imperatives of national security rather than the dispassionate pursuit of truth. We would gain a classified answer to a cosmic question, but in doing so, would we not be defining ourselves not as a species of explorers, but as a species of soldiers, fortifying our tiny world against the great and silent dark? And so, as the data streams flow and the analysts toil in their sealed room, a more haunting question begins to take shape, one that doubtless fuels the late-night discussions among the generals and the admirals. Is it possible that 3I divided by Atlas is not merely an interstellar object, but a strategic signal of a nature beyond human life itself? The silence in the briefing room is a physical presence, thick and heavy, absorbing the ambient hum of climate control and the faint rustle of documents. It is a silence born not from a lack of data, but from a profound surplus of it, a torrent of numbers and trajectories that coalesce into a single, unnerving image on the central display. The object designated 3I divided by Atlas hangs there, a spectral point of light against the star-charted void, and the unspoken question that permeates the strategic air is far more unsettling than any vocalized alarm. Are we looking at an object, a mere celestial vagabond, or are we witnessing the opening lines of a strategic communique, authored by an intelligence for which we have no precedent? This is the haunting question for strategic planners. Is 3I divided by Atlas not merely an interstellar object, but a strategic signal from beyond human life? The distinction is everything, for one is a subject for scientific inquiry, while the other is a cipher demanding a response, a first move in a game whose rules we did not write and whose players we cannot see. From the perspective of mainstream astrophysics, the initial appearance of 3I divided by Atlas could be framed within a known, if rare, cosmological context. Scientists suggest this could be due to the chaotic dynamics of planetary formation in distant star systems, where gravitational interactions can fling primordial bodies, comets, asteroids, fragments of planetary crust out into the galactic void. These objects, known as interstellar interlopers, are predicted to occasionally traverse our solar system, their hyperbolic trajectories a testament to gravitational slingshots that occurred eons ago. According to current models, the discovery of such an object was only a matter of time, a statistical inevitability, given the vast number of such nomads theorized to populate the interstellar medium. The initial detection protocols, the triangulation of its path by a global network of observatories, all followed the established script for a momentous, yet fundamentally natural, astronomical discovery. But does the mere application of a known category truly capture the essence of an anomaly, or does it simply provide a comforting label for a phenomenon that may defy all our existing classifications? This is where the first, more speculative hypothesis emerges, suggesting that 3I divided by Atlas is not a passive piece of cosmic debris, but a test probe, a calibrated instrument designed to measure the response profile of an emergent planetary civilization. Its very nature, its trajectory, its composition, its silence, could be a diagnostic tool. A natural object would follow a predictable path dictated solely by gravity. A probe, however, might exhibit subtle, non-gravitational accelerations, minor course corrections that are not random noise but deliberate, minimalistic data points. By observing how our global sensor network, our telescopes, our radar installations, our satellite arrays reacts to its presence, an external observer could map our technological footprint, our curiosity, our paranoia, and our collective decision-making latency. Every observation we make, every classified report we generate, every military satellite we retask to track it, becomes a data point in their assessment. Or perhaps, even more chillingly, it functions as a data relay node for a network whose full architecture lies in the profound darkness between the stars, a single repeater station in a galactic internet, passively collecting and transmitting the faint, radio frequency whispers of our species into the depths. If this is the case, then our most sophisticated scientific investigations are merely feeding a stream of intelligence to an audience we cannot perceive. So what, then, is the appropriate posture for a civilization that suddenly finds itself under an unseen microscope? The precedents for such a paradigm shift, while terrestrial in origin, provide a crucial framework for our bewilderment. The earlier interstellar visitor, Oumuamua, already ignited fierce debates within the scientific community, not merely for its unusual shape, but for its perplexing non-gravitational acceleration. While outgassing, the venting of volatile materials, much like a comet, was proposed as a natural explanation. The lack of a visible coma or dust cloud left the phenomenon inadequately explained, leaving a door ajar for more speculative interpretations. Furthermore, the long-established protocols of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, SETI, are predicated on the necessity of multi-station verification for any signal deemed to possess a non-random, structured pattern. This rigorous process, designed to eliminate terrestrial interference and hoaxes, underscores a fundamental scientific principle. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary and independently verifiable evidence. Our radio observatories continuously monitor fast radio bursts, those brilliant, millisecond-long flashes of cosmic radio waves whose origins are still hotly debated, searching for patterns that might distinguish a natural astrophysical engine from an engineered beacon. The very existence of these protocols and research programs reveals that the scientific community has long been preparing, at least conceptually, for the moment when a natural phenomenon must be re-evaluated as a potential strategic signal. But are our terrestrial and scientific protocols, designed for a world of peer review and empirical validation, robust enough to handle a signal that operates on a timescale and with an intent we cannot fathom? To deconstruct this unprecedented scenario, one must analyze it across three distinct, yet interconnected, levels of engagement. The first is the level of perception and identification, where a fundamental misclassification could trigger a cascade of unintended consequences. If a major power were to incorrectly identify 3I divided by Atlas as a hostile weapon or a reconnaissance platform deployed by a terrestrial adversary, the resulting escalation, a preemptive military response. The activation of anti-satellite systems could be catastrophic, a tragic overreaction born of terrestrial paranoia projected onto a cosmic canvas. The second level concerns our strategic countermeasures, the deliberate crafting of a non-hostile message to be transmitted via radio or optical channels. This endeavor is fraught with philosophical and practical difficulties, as it requires us to encode our intentions, our biology, and our culture into a universal language that may not exist, all while attempting to assure a potentially vastly superior intelligence of our benign nature. The third, and most profound, level is that of civilization itself, forcing humanity into its first ever negotiation over the rules of interstellar communication in a context devoid of any pre-existing law or precedent. We would be tasked with drafting a constitution for a dialogue with an unknown other, establishing protocols for first contact, data exchange, and mutual non-interference, all without the other party being present at the negotiating table. Can a species, so deeply divided by its own borders and ideologies, coalesce into a single, coherent interlocutor before a presence that regards our entire world as a single entity? The potential outcomes of this encounter present a stark dichotomy of existential risk and unparalleled opportunity. The opportunity is the chance to open a doorway to cosmic diplomacy, to gain knowledge that could leapfrog our understanding of physics, biology, and our place in the universe by millennia. It is the promise of ending our cosmic loneliness and joining a community of intelligences we have only ever dreamed of. The risk, however, is that this first moment of contact becomes permanently framed by the logic of deterrence and military strategy, a dark forest paradigm made manifest where the default assumption is threat. The initial relationship, the foundational impression between humanity and whatever lies beyond, could be irrevocably distorted by fear, setting a trajectory of suspicion and secrecy that might last for centuries. The shadow of our own terrestrial history of colonial expansion and cultural subjugation looms large over this moment, begging the question of whether we can approach the cosmos with a maturity we have so rarely shown ourselves. Will our first foray into interstellar relations be guided by the better angels of our nature, our curiosity and hope, or will it be dictated by the ancient, fearful ghosts of our own violent past, forever colouring the genesis of this new relationship in the darkest of hues? And as these weighty deliberations unfold in secure rooms on Earth, the object itself continues its silent, unwavering journey, its path through the inner solar system, traced by the most sensitive instruments at our disposal. The data on its velocity and trajectory, compiled from relentless observations by institutions like the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, begins to tell a story that is increasingly difficult to reconcile with the simple pull of gravity. The orbit of 3I divided by Atlas is not a perfect, predictable hyperbola. It displays subtle anomalies, minute deviations that are just outside the margin of error, perturbations that cannot be fully accounted for by the gravitational influence of the Sun or its planets. It moves with a cadence that suggests not merely a passive body falling along a geodesic, but something that possesses a faint, residual agency of its own. Could these tiny, almost imperceptible irregularities in its path be the key to unlocking its true nature? The first hard evidence that we are not dealing with a rock, but with a piece of technology? Of course. Here is the script, crafted in the requested style. The cosmos, in its profound and silent calculus, operates on a set of principles we believe we have come to understand. The graceful, predictable arcs of celestial bodies are the poetry of gravity, a verse written in the immutable language of mass and velocity. For generations, we have listened to this poetry, transcribed it into our models, and trusted in its consistency. Yet, occasionally, a whisper of dissonance emerges from the chorus, a single note that refuses to harmonize with the grand symphony. Such is the enigma presented by the trajectory of the interstellar object, 3I divided by Atlas, as meticulously observed by the vigilant instruments of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Its path, a faint scar across the celestial sphere, does not conform to the elegant predictions of our gravitational tables. It is an orbit that refuses to obey the spreadsheet, marked by minute but stubborn deviations, a subtle and persistent defiance that challenges the very foundations of our celestial mechanics. If the universe is a clockwork of unimaginable precision, then 3I divided by Atlas is the faint, inexplicable tick that is out of sync, forcing us to question whether we are truly hearing the mechanism or merely its echo. According to current models of non-gravitational forces, such anomalies are not entirely without precedent, particularly within our own solar system. Comets, those ancient icy wanderers, are known to exhibit slight orbital perturbations due to outgassing, the process by which sublimating ices, heated by the Sun, jet from the nucleus like microscopic thrusters, imparting a small but measurable force. Dynamicist groups routinely factor these jetting forces into their calculations for solar system comets, treating them as a natural, if complex, variable in the orbital equation. With 3I divided by Atlas, the initial assumption was that we were observing a similar, albeit more potent, phenomenon, an interstellar comet venting volatile materials accumulated in the deep freeze of interstellar space. The constant, nagging uncertainty in its trajectory, the relentless need to update its ephemeris, could logically be attributed to an unusually active and asymmetrical outgassing pattern, a natural and chaotic process playing out on a microscopic scale. But what if the chaos is not so chaotic? What if the pattern, however complex, belies a different kind of physics altogether, one where the jets are not merely the random size of a melting iceberg, but the controlled exhalations of a designed system? This line of inquiry leads us to a far more speculative, yet profoundly intriguing hypothesis, that 3I divided by Atlas is equipped with a system of micro-force adjustment. Imagine not the violent plumes of a rocket engine, but something far more subtle, a network of regulated, evaporative jets, or perhaps the application of a weak, localized magnetic field, capable of fine-tuning its orientation and, by infinitesimal degrees, its path through the void. Such a system would not require immense power, but rather an exquisitely precise application of force, a gentle and continuous nudge against the currents of space-time. The observed deviations, so stubbornly resistant to conventional modeling, would be the inevitable signature of such a capability, a signature written in a language of momentum and vectors that we are only just beginning to decipher. Is it not conceivable that a voyage of such unimaginable duration and distance would necessitate a means of course correction, a way to steer between the gravitational shoals of unseen stars and dark matter substructures. To properly dissect this possibility, we must analyze it across three distinct levels of complexity, each peeling back a layer of the mystery. On the primary, physical level, the challenge is one of modeling these microscopic force sources. Our most sophisticated computational fluid dynamics simulations struggle to recreate the specific pattern of acceleration observed, for the outgassing would need to be not only powerful, but also asymmetrical, in a way that seems to counteract external forces with an uncanny efficiency. It behaves less like a leaf buffeted by the wind, and more like a vessel trimming its sails. This forces the question, does our failure to perfectly model its motion reveal a gap in our understanding of fundamental plasma physics and material science in extreme environments? Or does it point to something else entirely, something that operates on principles we have not yet codified? Ascending to the systemic level, the analysis becomes even more profound. If we entertain, even for a moment, the possibility of intentional adjustment, the very nature of the object transforms. It ceases to be a mere rock or a block of ice and becomes a system. The assumption of a guidance mechanism, however primitive, must be weighed against the staggering improbability of its natural occurrence. A system implies function, and function implies design. The micro-adjustments, if they are that, are not random noise, they are information. They tell a story of interaction with its environment, a story of response. Could it be that we are not looking at an object, but at an entity, one that is, in its own slow and deliberate way, aware of the space through which it is moving? This, inevitably, leads us to the final, strategic level of consideration, a perspective that shifts the enigma from the realm of pure science to that of existential pragmatism. An object capable of altering its course, however slightly, complicates our entire approach to orbital defense and planetary security. Our current models for tracking near-Earth objects operate on the assumption of predictable gravity-dominated trajectories. A wild card like 3I divided by Atlas, or any object that might share its capabilities, renders those models incomplete. The potential risks are stark. Such a capability could fuel pressures to exponentially increase military spending on space-based sensor networks and interception technologies, potentially creating a new, clandestine arms race in the high frontier, one that would inevitably cast a long shadow over, and perhaps even divert resources from peaceful civilian research. Yet, within this risk also lies a profound opportunity. The very anomalies that challenge us are a gift, forcing us to upgrade our models of non-gravitational forces, to refine our predictive algorithms for all celestial objects, and in doing so, to see the solar system with a new, more discerning clarity. The stubborn deviation of 3I divided by Atlas is a teacher, but are we prepared for the lessons it might be intending to impart and the burdens that such knowledge would invariably bring? The implications of a guided path are as vast as the void it traverses, suggesting a mind behind the trajectory, a purpose to its passage. But if there is a purpose, then would it not also require a voice? For what is a journey without a message, a presence without an announcement? This thought leads us inevitably from the silent, physical manipulations of its course to the realm of energy and information, to the whispers that followed in its wake, captured not by optical telescopes charting its path, but by the immense radio ears listening to the stars.